Right. Here, here. Okay. What I want to do, and I mentioned this in the message today, but I want to make sure it's clear. I'm going to finish off one more person. It'll take us a few minutes. One more Hasidic master, as he's different than the others we've discussed. Move into the Mitnagdim, some of the key personalities. That will roll into next week also, or the week after, depending if we have to cancel class next week. I might have to. And then we will get to the last of the few we'll deal with will be Reb Chaim Brisker, the whole Brisker approach to Torah, which is a hallmark of this time period of the personalities. After you've finished that, then what we really have to do is we have to kind of go back and do, as I said in the message, a zoom out. We talked about a whole bunch of with the birth of Chassidut and the people from Chassidut, and then we're talking about the Mitnagdim and all their personalities. That's great. Those are the biographies, but now we have to say, okay, what was going on in the Jewish world in general, besides just the personalities? So I know some people do the opposite. They'll talk about the general time period, then they'll go into the people. We've done that also. But right now, I want to stay the course with this idea that we'll finish up the Chassidut, at least one more in the Chassidut world, and move into the Mitnagdim. We're going to talk about Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin. He's born in 1823, so he's already at the latter part of the early days of Chassidut. This has already been after they've established many years of Hasidic masters, which are from the mid to late 1700s. So it's been a couple of generations, perhaps. He's born into a Lithuanian rabbinic family, which when we come to the next section, we talk about Mitnagdim, you'll see already, just hearing the word Lithuania, you're already going to say, like, what's he doing in the Hasidic section? We're going to see that. He was actually educated with the Mitnagdim approach to Torah, which, again, we have to discuss what that is. The non-Hasidic Lithuanian approach, and he became a tremendous Talmid Chacham, and in Gemara and in Halacha at a very young age. And this is again a theme that repeats itself and has repeated itself with so many of the people we've talked about. That he already was a rising star as a young man. We put it into modern terms. How many people do we know today who are in their 20s? Sometimes it was in their teens, but in their 20s, who are already seen as unbelievable prodigies, that they're going places. It's not that common. It's really not. But in this time period, which I guess, if you want to kind of take a little bit of a Kabbalistic approach and a Tanya approach, we talked about in Tanya, Hashem put certain neshamot in the time period for certain reasons, a different level of neshama. It was what was needed at the time. In any case, he married the daughter of a very wealthy family, but unfortunately, the marriage ended in divorce because of various halacha complications, and it involved also a disputed get. That episode in his life, which was very difficult that he talks about, actually figures very prominently in much of his writing about human suffering and divine providence. So it's one of the things that I like about history, and we talk specifically about people, is where does their hashkafa, where's their world view come from? And sometimes, very often, and most of the time, a lot of it's based on their teacher and their environment. But sometimes you'll also find that their own personal lives had a very strong impact on how they wrote. Lahavdil, you can't make such a comparison. Take authors of secular writing and what their lives, what happened in their own private lives, how it impacted the way that someone like Longfellow may have written, and somebody like Jane Austen may have written, and the list goes on and on, obviously, this endless list, has had an effect on the type of writing that they had and their perspective. With Aldous Huxley and E. Cummings, just again, you could be anybody, pick anybody, and it's just you learn their biographies before. One of the things they do, at least I've seen done in school, is when an author or a piece is going to be used for a section in Bagrut in English, that instead of just learning the piece by the author, you also learn about the author and figure out how his history or her history informed on the way they wrote, which is also fascinating. And Lahavdil, that's also how this fits in over here, that his very painful divorce and what he called his human suffering worked into his work. We're not going to look at any pieces about that, but just understand it. Now, in his 20s, now which means he's already seen as a prodigy probably in his teens. In his 20s, he goes through some dramatic spiritual transformation. And he does begin to encounter the world and the teachings of Chassidut, which he originally approached with skepticism, because remember, he's raised in a Mitnaged world. Again, at that time period, to be a Mitnaged, to be against, was not just, oh, I'm going to be this way instead of that way. It's you're this way and you're against that derech in Torah and in life. But he had an encounter with Rabbi Mordechai Yosef Leiner of Eibshutz. He was the author of the Mea Shiloach. Mea Shiloach is a very deep sefer, a lot of Kabbalistic, a lot of Hasidic work. And that encounter with that one sefer and that one teacher changed his life. He became a disciple of Rabbi Mordechai Yosef of Leiner of Eibshutz, known as the Eibshutzer, and eventually became one of the main descendants. I use that word in quotes because he wasn't a physical, actual descendant of his teaching when it came to Torah and it came to Chassidut. But Tzadok did something that was also, so first of all, he started off as a Mitnaged and moved into the Chassidi world. In addition to that, he did something else that wasn't very common among Hasidic masters because he himself grows into that role of Hasidic master. He did not establish his own Hasidic court. We use that expression many times, that the Chatzer, the court or courtyard of the Chassid, the rabbinic master, wasn't just literally a courtyard by his house, but it meant his environment, his surroundings, and where he used the expression in English to hold court. That's the same idea. He did live a relatively quiet life, tried to spend a lot of his time studying, davening, and writing, and eventually he settles in the city of Lublin, which shouldn't be any surprise when he's referred to as Rabbi Tzadok of Lublin. He wouldn't be from Detroit. He would be called from Lublin. Although the Clevelander Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik HaKadosh Livracha, lived in Netanya. Lived in Netanya. I personally knew him. He came to Chicago every year and was hosted by a neighbor of ours. It was the first time I was ever at a Hasidic Tish. Went to many of them with him. It was tremendous zechut to see him in action. And he was called the Clevelander Rebbe many years after he met Eliyahu from Cleveland to the Netanya. In any case, so he settles in Lublin. He becomes a Hasidic scholar. Like, he mixes halacha, Talmud with some mystical background as well. And he's a jack of all trades when it comes to this area. He was supported by a very close friend, Reb Leibel Eger. Now, that name might not sound familiar to you, but his grandfather's name will, Rabbi Akiva Eger. Rabbi Akiva Eger, who was known himself as a remarkable Hasidic master. If you open up almost any, I was asked, did he remarry? I don't believe he did. I would have to look into it, but I think he did not. But I will have to check. So thank you, Judy, for the question. If you open up almost any printing of the Talmud Bavli, you'll find on the side, among many other commentaries, the notes of Rabbi Akiva Eger. The problem with Rabbi Akiva Eger's commentary, very similar to that of the Vilna Gaon or the Gra on the Gemara, is that he wrote a lot of just Rashi Tevot, like initials of words, and maybe ayin, and look at Moed Katan Yudah Mudbet. And that's it. He didn't explain. You had to look everything up, understand what he was trying to say, understand the background. But his insights into the Gemara were considered extremely insightful. And it was his grandson, Reb Leibel Eger, who was the one who was actually supporting Reb Tzadok HaKohen. He lived modestly, and actually, like we've seen with some other great Hasidic masters, he lived a life of poverty, even though he could have been able to have the best of everything. He didn't care about honor. He didn't care about position. He was known for his humility, for his saintliness, which is tzidkut. One of the Sfarim he wrote, which we'll see, is called Tzidkat Tzaddik, not about himself, obviously. He also is known to have fasted very often and to have immersed himself in constant study of Torah, both what's called the Nigle and Nistar, both the revealed Torah and the hidden. He did whatever he could to get out of any public leadership role. So that's one of the reasons he didn't have his Hasidic court. But at the same time, and he also didn't want to be called Rebbe. He didn't want to be called that, even though probably his followers did call him that. He didn't want the title. But he did influence not only future generations of Hasidim, but also non-Hasidic scholars as well. Generally, like very general terms, if you will listen to enough shiurim across the spectrum of the Hasidic world and the Mitnaged world, you will probably 20 to 30% of the time hear his name come up or his svarim come up. He's extremely popular, extremely well quoted. He was also, because he was an original thinker, he came up with ideas that people had not thought of earlier in areas halacha, philosophy, Kabbalah, Chassidut. And I just want to tell you a couple of the names of the svarim he wrote. Tzidkat Tzaddik. They are, what the word in English is. I think I'm hopefully not misusing this word, aphorisms. Aphorisms, phrases, ideas, meditations on the topic of Bechira Chofshit, free will, on the topic of the neshama, the soul, on the topic of Avodat Hashem, very light conversational things you have over, dinner at wherever. He also wrote a sefer called Pri Tzadik, which were commentaries on Parshat Shavua, also on the Chagim, and he has lots of Hasidic insights woven into that as well. And a few others he has, but he's mostly known as Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen, Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, Tzidkat Tzadik, Pri Tzadik. All these, and then again, we've seen before in both worlds that an author of a sefer is very often known by his name, like the Chavetz Chaim. If you ask, say to the average person who has even some basic knowledge, by the way, did you see what Rabbi, what I want to say, which example? Did you see what Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan said on that halacha? I say, who's he? Well, he happens to have been the Chavetz Chaim. If you say Meir from Radin already, maybe you'll get a little bit more eyes saying, oh, okay, we know who he is. In any case, I want to share with you just a couple of his basic approaches and thoughts, and then we're going to move on to the other area. And this is going to sound familiar because, again, it follows the stream all the way back to the Baal Shem Tov. Now we're almost 50 years later, 60 years later, that everything that we see is a direct expression of a divine will. Even somehow, they wrote, sin works into Hashem's cosmic plan. Failure is very often noted as a precursor to growth, to spiritual growth. And even the Yetzer Hara is part of God's plan to get a person to do mitzvot properly, to kovesh his Yetzer, to overcome his Yetzer. What about the land of Israel? Now, when we get into the general picture of what's going on in Jewish history, we'll note that this is just before the birth of what we would call today Zionism. It's not yet. The first Aliyah and Herzl and all. So we're dancing on an unbelievable time period of what I would almost call modern Jewish history. But his outlook on that every Jew has a spark and a mission in the time period he or she is living, and that all Jewish history reflects a divine purpose. You don't have to go anywhere beyond your computer or your newspaper right now to see how accurate that is. He passed away in the year 1900. So we're not talking about someone who lived, 500 years ago. It's 125 years ago. He passed away in Lublin. He did not leave behind a Hasidic dynasty, but his influence was mostly through his writings. As I say, continues to this very day. It's used by Litvaks, a term we're going to come to shortly, Litvish Jew, Hasidim, religious Zionists. There is a sefer, Vayoel Moshe, written by the Satmar Rebbe, that I don't have in my house, not Bashita, but he's an anti-Zionist, but there's still plenty of Torah in there. And there's a lot of good stuff. You also always, even if it's someone's not your cup of tea, doesn't agree with your approach to how you may live your life, we have to understand that Torah is still Torah. And if the message is clear, and the Satmar Rebbe or Rav Kook, it's kind of hard to put those two names in the same sentence, but have opposing views. But it's interesting insight into the Parsha or into Judaism or something philosophical. You take what you can and leave behind that which you don't want. He is seen also, and this is one of the last comments, as the bridge between the Brisker world, which we'll have to learn about next week, and Kabbalah, and the bridge between the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov. Now, why is that so wild? Because remember, they were antagonists. The Baal Shem Tov, who's the founder of the Hasidic movement, the Vilna Gaon is the founder of the Mitnaged, but he's seen as some form of a bridge between the two because of the double background he had, both in terms of the world growing up as Mitnaged and then moving into the world of Hasidut. Adkan. Adkan could go on for months. Try to do that. Talking about Hasidut and Hasidic masters, time to move on. We're going to move a little bit back in time. We just now ended with the year 1900, which is pretty far ahead because I'm going to go back to a lot of 17 and 1800s over the next couple of weeks. We're going to go back to the year to the late 17th, early 18th centuries, which means the late 1600s into the early 1700s. I'm going to start tonight. We'll see. We have hopefully we'll be able to talk about two people that they're famous not just for who they were and what they did and what they wrote, but a very specific incident, which I hope to get to tonight. If you're familiar with it, great. If you're not familiar with it, buckle up. It'll be a very bumpy ride. First one's name is Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz. He born in 1690 and died in 1764. So he was 74 years old when he died, which already at that time period of history is kind of an old man. Today, thank God, that's not considered old. His early life. He's born in Krakow in Poland. So you see now we moved out of some of the areas, some of the other individuals that we've been speaking about in Ukraine, mostly, and in others. He's born, again, himself into a very prominent rabbinic family. His father was a dayan, a rabbinic court judge. His mother was a direct descendant of the Maharal of Prague, whom we did not speak about. But those of you who know, the Maharal of Prague was a shining light of Judaism. Again, at a young age, again, the story that in Hebrew say, Sipur shechozer atzmo. It's a story that repeats itself. He's already seen as an ilui, in English, a genius or a prodigy as a child, in two ways. One was his clarity of thought, but the other was his incredible memory. There are multiple types of memory. I'm not talking about short-term, long-term memory. I'm talking about people who have a good memory. There are those who have a good memory, some who have a great memory. There's something called a photographic memory that you actually see the page that you read. And there's something called an eidetic memory. Eidetic memory is you don't only remember what you saw or you read, but you remember everything that was surrounding it. You remember what you were wearing. You remember. And then there's a word that's even stronger that a handful of people in the world have. One of the actresses, Mary Lou Henner, actually has this. She's been interviewed about this, where she will remember every single moment of her life, everything, and which is very difficult because you can also imagine that you're not only remembering it, but you also remember the feelings. So whether it was elation or sadness, that's always there. And there are people who've been interviewed with that type of memory. We've called it an absolute curse. They wish they could do anything to forget. We have been blessed. Hashem has given us a bracha of shichicha, of forgetfulness, because we don't want to remember everything. It's a very, very, you want to remember a lot of things that are important, but there are things you don't want to remember. Things you've seen, things you've felt, incidences, hurt, whatever it might be, sadness. I can't tell you what type of memory he had, but I can tell you it was probably eidetic, which meant he had not just what he saw and read, but everything that surrounded it based on the writings that he came out with later in life. He learned also in the yeshiva of the Pnei Yoshua. Again, I'm not going to get into it, as Rabbi Yaakov Yoshua Falk. He's used in almost every yeshiva as a commentary when a person learns beyond just the actual Gemara. They'll learn the Chidush Ramban, the Ritva, the Meiri, and Pnei Yehoshua, Shita Mekubetza. That these words and names mean nothing to you, that's fine. But he learns in the yeshiva of somebody who authored a sefer that is used in virtually every yeshiva around. He spends his early part of his life in Prague, and he becomes the head of a yeshiva, and then later still he becomes the chief rabbi of Prague in 1750. He's invited to become some kind of influential post, prestigious and influential in Germany. So now remember, we're not talking Ukraine, we're not talking the Hasidic world, we're talking a different, we're talking the Ashkenazi Litvish world, which we're going to talk, I'll define what that means soon. He authored a book called the Urim V'Tumim, which is on Choshen Mishpat. For those of you with a good memory, you'll remember that that's the name of one of the 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch. And it was known for its analytical reasoning, for its practical applications, meaning it wasn't just pie in the sky, but a lot of tachlis of what people, a morahora, a person who was poskening questions, would need to know. He also wrote a Kreisi Uplesi on Yeridea, which is a halacha commentary, Ahavat Yonatan, a drash, and mystical writings. He did not see Kabbalah as something separate from normative halacha. I'm going to explain to you what that means. I may have told you this a few years ago. I decided it was time to start not delving into Kabbalah, but to start learning. Like first, there's a sefer I have that has like the main nomenclature of Kabbalah. How do you learn math without knowing what a plus sign is? How do you learn Kabbalah without knowing what certain topics, certain terms mean? So I got the sefer, I was learning it, and I decided there was someone recommended to me, a particular individual to start watching online who's giving shiurim in basic Kabbalah. And the first shiur is just an introduction, and who is very adamant in something, and this comes directly from someone like Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz, which is that it's not that you have the world of halacha and you have the world of Kabbalah, and that you have to know halacha, but Kabbalah is for a handful of people. He felt that there was a synthesis between the two, and that they go hand in hand, and that there was a requirement to learn Kabbalah. What about you're not supposed to learn Kabbalah till you're 40, and you'll have to learn from someone who knows and all. Truth of the matter is, and I gave a shiur on this once, it's not original. I heard it from somebody and I borrowed it, which is the synthesis of halacha and Kabbalah, which, believe it or not, you see throughout the Shulchan Aruch many, many, many times. You would think like, I don't have anything to do with Kabbalah, but trust me, it's in there in plenty of places, as early as the very beginning of the Shulchan Aruch, and especially in the commentaries. So he was very much adamant about people needing to learn from the proper teacher, not just halacha, but also Kabbalah. He was also politically savvy. He was very much involved with governmental figures. And one of the things he did with that is able to defend Jewish communities when there were problems. A woman who was considered from the upper class of the Jews came to him one time for help with a mysterious illness. He wrote what's called in Hebrew a kameah, kuf mem yud ayin. In English, it's called an amulet. And soon after that, she recovered. The story about him doing that and the recovery gave him a reputation of a miracle worker. But at the same time, it caused a problem. You're going to have to put that problem off to the side for a few minutes till we get to it, because there's a tremendous controversy that comes out of that. Because in order to understand what that controversy was, we're going to learn about one other man who was a contemporary of his, and then we'll talk about that controversy. And that is Rabbi Yaakov Emden. For those of you who belong, I don't remember when we started, but we started the Tefillah class, was a couple of years ago. At the beginning of the Tefillah class, after the introduction, one of the people I mentioned was Rabbi Yaakov Emden, because he's the author of a commentary on the Siddur. Siddur is about that thick. That is not just a classic commentary on Siddur and the halacha of davening, but also insights into Tefillah, which really, and I have one of my hobbies is Siddurim, and it's absolutely magnificent what he has. In any case, Rabbi Yaakov Rabbi Yaakov Emden, it's Rabbi Yaakov Me Emden. He's just known as Rabbi Yaakov Emden. He's born also in 1697, dies in 1776. It's a year that American Jews will be able to recognize right away what that is. Remember that both Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz and Rabbi Yaakov Emden are not most of their life living in the time yet of Hasidic Mitnaged world. It's going to be near the end of their lives. It's going to kick in, but in order to understand who comes next, you have to understand the building blocks. He's born in Altona, in Germany, and he's the son of the Chacham Tzvi. Again, it's another well-known Gadol B'Yisrael, who himself was a major halachic authority. What was he known for? What was Rabbi Yaakov Emden known for? Because I said about his Sidur, but that's like saying Rav Kook was known for his book Ein Ayah. It's like a teeny little bit of him. Who was he? His mahut, his essence, was all about seeking uncompromising dedication to emet, to truth, and in fiercely wanted to protect the idea of independence of thought, the idea of you have the right to think, you have the right to grow, you have the right to come up with ideas as long as they're within the area of Torah and that they don't go against Torah. He supported himself because he didn't want to become a Rav. He was also offered positions. He didn't want to be a Rav of a community. He supported himself as a printer in Altona, which is a suburb or division, a subdivision of Hamburg, Germany. He was a printer, which helped him because he also printed many of his own works. So that was very helpful. That's how he made a living. I think it's very important to understand in light of modern politics and political perspectives that all the way back to the time of the Talmud and way before, but in the Talmud you see hundreds of Rabbanim who had regular jobs. There's Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, who was a blacksmith. You have Rabbi Yochanan Sandlar, he was a shoemaker. Like, they had jobs, they had work. It wasn't just, there were a handful of people that certainly sat and learned all the time. And even at this time period, you had many, because remember, the concept of a yeshiva as we know it does not really exist. They have study halls, and under certain people you learned it, but the formula of a yeshiva is going to be one of the people we're going to probably meet next week, but not this week. So he's a printer. He lives in his hometown of Altona in Hamburg, Germany, and he prints many of his own works. He prints the Sidur, as I mentioned to you. He also publishes a series of responsa of Shelot and Shuvot, and he also attacked the authenticity of the Zohar. Remember, he's the one who very much believed in the Kabbalistic approach and the learning Kabbalah, but he has a book called Nehemiah Chayun. He tries to expose someone named Nehemiah Chayun, who he's trying to question the authenticity of the Zohar. That doesn't mean the Zohar is not the Zohar. There is to this day a debate as to whether Rabbi Akiva actually was the author of the Zohar back in the cave, or was it someone many, many centuries later? Don't look at me. I don't have an answer. Whatever it is, it's still the Zohar. But one of his main goals in life, remember, we have to go back to our dear friend, quote unquote, Shabtai Tzvi, who was in the mid-16 and late 1600s. He is now living just about 50 years afterwards, and he is an anti-Sabbatean. Well, it's a big deal, right? What's the big deal? This is after Shabtai Tzvi. He considered the movement of the Shabbatean movement, one of the greatest, if not the greatest threat to Judaism, still, even after Shabtai Tzvi was gone. And he attacked anybody who he felt would be having any connection to or the same teachings of Shabtai Tzvi. In addition to that, he was a very controversial individual. You may remember that number of months ago, we discussed the Va'ad Arba Ratzot, or the Council of Four Lands, Bohemia, South Podolia, and others, that were kind of a self-governing body of Jews living in that part of Europe, where they had takanot, they had various statements they agreed that all the people in those countries would follow. He fought bitterly in many cases, against the Va'ad Arba Ratzot. Um, and his honesty and passion alienated a lot of people. You know, you don't have to always say what's on your mind. You don't always have to. In Pirkei Avot, we left off this past Thursday with the phrase that we're going to get into Bezrat Hashem this Thursday of Siag lechochma shtika. One of the ways to make sure you are can be wise and be perceived as wise is keep your mouth quiet. Again, not everything you think is worth saying, nor is it worth posting on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And, oh, I saw a beautiful cat today. Oh, whoop-de-doo. But he didn't. He said what was on his mind. Remember, he was not a Rav in a community. And telling you as a former Rav of a community that you can't always say what's on your mind. You have to say when it's necessary. And I did say some very controversial things in the back, as they say, back in the day. Sometimes got pushback, but I didn't care. You didn't hire me to say, oh, everything's great. You hired me because I'm trying to help you, I hope, improve your life somewhat. But he didn't have that. He didn't have a board of directors, and he didn't have congregants. He had, want to listen to him, fine. You don't want to listen to him, fine. But see, he was considered very controversial. He even accused some of the very leading rabbis of his time of heresy, but he still felt he was coming from a perspective of defending Torah. He never was doing it out of malice. He felt that he was, because remember, his whole mahut, his essence was about truth and seeking the truth. And he felt that if something was not true, that he had to call it out. He once received a question, a halachic question from a faraway town. And he responded with clarity, with precision, with chidushim, with new approaches to this, citing all kinds of sources, and in many cases just from memory. And then later on, the rabbi who sent him the question actually admitted publicly he did it just to test Rabbi Emden's erudition. It was a test. That was not even a real question. That's kind of stinky, but he passed the test. I want to talk about the controversy that went on for a very long time, over a period of years, between Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz and Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Two people I've mentioned this evening, besides Rabbi Tzadok, who we put into the category of the Chachamim of the Hasidic world. It became known as the Emden Eibshutz controversy. Obviously not in English. It wasn't known that way. It was probably in Yiddish and German. And it centered around an accusation of secretly a person being a follower of Shabtai Tzvi. So I'm not going to redo the whole background to Shabtai Tzvi. You know that he was a heretic and he claimed he was the Mashiach. He ends up converting to Islam at the end of his life. He was a false Messiah, blah, blah, blah. We already did this many times and talked about it. Decades after he died, there were still suspicions of what became known as crypto-Sabbatianism. Now, you know the expression crypto Jews were known as the Anusim, or the hidden Jews. They were called pejoratively Maranos. Marano means pigs, which is a horrible thing to call them, from back in Spain, mostly in Spain. But even decades after Shabtai Tzvi died, there were still people who secretly followed and believed he was Mashiach. And in some cases among Kabbalists and mystics as well. So we already know that Yaakov Emden was himself a very, very fierce anti-Sabbatian individual. He saw it as one of his life missions. Why? How does that fit in with his missions to expose any trace of heresy such as this? Because again, his life mission, he saw, was emet, was truth. And that's the antithesis of truth. It's the anti-Torah. So it was his mission to expose that. So in the meantime, and we know that Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz himself becomes very popular, very famous. He's an orator. He's charismatic. He has a lot of followers. And then one day, I'm going to read you a short paragraph. In 1751, while serving as Dayan and later Rabbi in Altoona, Yonason Eibshutz was involved in a dramatic incident. This is what I was referring to briefly before. A woman in the city of Metz, where he had previously served as rabbi, became pregnant after wearing an amulet. Sorry, this is a different story. This is the one that was the story that becomes the controversy. She became pregnant after wearing an amulet or kamea that Yonason Eibshutz had given her. Evidently, she was having trouble having children. He wrote a kamea, which looks you can look online, you'll find pictures of these things. Evidently, there's certain people today that still write kameas. And that he gave it to her, and she became pregnant. Shalom Yisrael. Well, evidently, the amulet was opened, and when it was opened, it was allegedly found to have some allusions to Shabtai Tzvi and his beliefs. Remember, we talked about what he came to eradicate certain things, and mitzvot, and changes, and even in some cases, the initials of Shabtai Tzvi were somehow referred to as the King Mashiach Shabtai was somehow alluded to in this particular amulet. Jews like a good rumor and a good controversy. So rumors traveled what's his name? Churchill said, a lie makes its way around the world before truth has a chance to put its pants on. And it's very true. People love gossip. People love to hear negative, and countering it and making it not understand that it's not the truth is extremely difficult. So rumors traveled very quickly. And some even said that Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz had written many amulets that also had many symbols inside of it, words and references to the Sabbatean movement and Shabtai Tzvi, and maybe that he was a closet Sabbatean. Dun, dun, dun. That's where you have to put that music in. Rabbi Yaakov Emden launched a full-on accusation publicly against Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz, and in 1751 he accused him publicly of being a closet Sabbatean, propagating heretical beliefs, deceiving the people, cloaking it in his rabbinic garb that he was a Rav, and what he said has to be correct. Rabbi Emden's claims against Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz were that there were cryptic references to the Shabtai Tzvi, that it included some reference to certain individuals who already were known to be followers of Shabtai Tzvi, and that he believed that Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz was actually a part of a secret mystical sect trying to revive Sabbateanism. Well, what about Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz? What's his response? He vehemently denies these things. He claimed that the amulets were standard Kabbalistic formulas that were used for protection, they were used for fertility. There are no Sabbatean leanings or meanings whatsoever. He said that people were deliberately distorting what he had written, and it was either by Rabbi Yaakov Emden was doing it on purpose, or some of Rabbi Yaakov Emden's allies were doing it on purpose. And he said that he completely 100% subscribed to normative halacha, and his sermons, in his statements, in his svarim, and that no way, shape, or form is he a Sabbatean. Now, when you have two giants who go to war, and it's almost what it was, it also helps if there are people supporting one side or the other. So he actually did have some defenders. He had, interestingly enough, the Vada Baratzot supported him and came out in his favor. The rabbinic court, the Beit Din of Hamburg, did not remove him from his post. They supported him. Many leading rabbis in Eastern Europe also were supportive, but some did something right out of Parshat Korach. I'll explain to you what I mean. Because last week was Parshat Korach, I have to mention this. This is something I heard many, many years ago, and I use it. I say it anytime I have the opportunity, and it fits in absolutely perfectly here. If you read the first Aliyah or two of Parshat Korach, you learn about the challenge to Moshe, the challenge to Aaron. You have Korach and his 250 followers, Datan, Aviram. You have all these personalities. But there's something glaringly missing in the Torah. It doesn't appear anywhere in Midrash. It doesn't appear, I can't say anywhere, because I haven't read all Midrashim, but I'm not aware of anywhere it says in Midrash, it says anywhere that for sure not in the Torah. But the average guy in the street, he sees this challenge to Moshe, this tremendous chutzpah to the leader of Am Yisrael, who's done everything, bend over backwards to help Am Yisrael. And to Aaron HaKohen, poor Nebuch Aaron, he gets drawn into this? Nothing. The average Jew didn't say a word. They're just kind of bystanders sitting around and watching. It's a horrible, horrible perspective. Because when you see Torah being attacked, and that's what it was, you have to stand up. You have to say something, no matter what your position is in this world. You're not allowed to stand by and watch Torah and leaders being attacked. And that's what was happening in some of these communities in Eastern Europe. They saw this controversy. They didn't want to take any sides. Well, there has to be a side. Now, it could be simple enough. They didn't have the facts. And they decided they're not going to say anything without facts. That's fine. But you did have some people who evidently were big guys. I shouldn't say guys, big rabbis. And again, they didn't say anything. This debate became very public, very intense. There were pamphlets and booklets written back and forth that Eibshutz was being accused of heresy, deception, spiritual danger, causing the Jewish people to go down the tubes. And he responds with his own pamphlets. Each side tries to, I didn't yet, but I'm going to see if I can find if there are any that exist, copies of these online somewhere, maybe in the National Library, but may have scans of them. I don't know. This is not that long ago. It's a couple of 100 years back. A little bit more. In Altoona, in his hometown, it reaches a tremendous fever pitch. The supporters of Rabbi Yaakov Emden and Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz physically clashed. Emden's house was attacked by a mob of people who supported Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz, which actually caused him to run away from the city for a period of time. The secular Hamburg Senate and the Danish monarchy, which were the ones who ruled at that time over Altoona, got involved to restore order. Chilul Hashem. By the way, you think this is old? This doesn't happen. Just take a look at some things that have happened specifically in the Hasidic world in the last 10, 20 years between brothers who each one felt they were the successor to their father in the Hasidic world who died. They have two different camps now, and they have physically gotten into it, whether it's certain things that happened in Chabad, all kinds of amazing things. This is not a new story. But the problem was, of course, that when you have the giants who are of the generation who are at war, it causes a division among the people themselves. The Noda Yehuda, who we will learn about Bezrat Hashem, Rabbi Cheskel Landau, came out in favor of Yonason Eibshutz, and he actually wrote a responsa in his responsum in defense of him. Others, as I say, remain silent, or they issue ambiguous statements such as, we call for all sides to show restraint. Boy, I wonder where I've ever heard that before. There was no clear judicial verdict ever rendered in the situation. The consensus that emerged in the latter part of the 18th century was that it leaned towards Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz being Orthodox, not being a Sabbatean, but the suspicions never disappeared. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, to the day he died, believed and he was convinced that Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz was in fact a Sabbatean. Interestingly enough, the actual amulets written by Rabbi Yonason Eibshutz were discovered in the 20th century in Prague, and many scholars like Gershon Shalom claimed that they did contain some Sabbatean symbols, but others claimed there was nothing conclusive. Some say that maybe he dabbled in some esoteric Sabbatean ideas, but did not subscribe to them. Others just said that Rabbi Yaakov Emden was just obsessively fixated on it, and he did it damage his own reputation. And is there a conclusion? There's no conclusion, because there's no one who can tell us one way or the other. But it is a black mark in Jewish history of this massive war that they had. It laid the foundation for a couple other similar situations, not the same topic, but similar situations that happened over the next couple hundred years. But to end with a good note, so we don't end with all this stuff, that right on the heels of this time when we have these two Gedolei Yisrael at war, along comes another man whose name is Chaim of Volozhin, who becomes the architect of the Litvish Torah world. And I'm going to leave you hanging with what that means and why he is the driving force basically behind every yeshiva in the world till today. We'll discuss him Bezrat Hashem. Now, there's a chance we will not be having class next week. I'll send out a notice one way or the other. But in the meantime, everyone have a wonderful evening. So let's hear some good B'sorot Tovot.
Thank
And
you.
you're very welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.